I don't know how much truth I'm actually going to be ascribing to you about bees, but more just kind of where we stand as far as our understanding. As I was introduced, I'm at NC State University in the Department of Entomology, which is the study of insects. And because it's the land-grant University of North Carolina, land-grant universities being tied very intimately with agriculture within the state, many agriculture schools have departments of entomology because insects are so incredibly vital to agricultural production, right? Usually in the form of pest insects. However, most entomology departments also have an emphasis on people who study beneficial insects, because not all insects are bad, some insects are good. And so therefore, many entomology departments across the nation have a counterpart studying honeybees. And so our apiculture program studies honeybees in all sorts of various fashions. And as you probably have heard, there's been a lot of buzz or a lot of media attention concerning the decline of honeybees. And so I just want to go ahead and address some of those and where we stand in our current understanding and science of that topic. Now, 12 years ago when I started at NC State, I actually had to justify to many people why I had a job, right? That it wasn't as clear at that time about the importance of honeybees for pollination. A lot of people just thought that honeybees were important for honey. And they are, in fact, important for honey and other hive products like we have down the road at Burt's Bees. They use a lot of beeswax in their products, right? But really the overwhelming economic value of honeybees is through pollination. And this is something that I think now is much more common knowledge than it was 12 years ago, in large part thanks to the plight that honeybees and other pollinators have been having. And just to put that into some perspective, it's been estimated that honeybees are responsible for a good $15 to $20 billion every year in added agricultural productivity. In other words, we would have about 1/3 less to eat every day than if we didn't have honeybees pollinating those crops. So a good 100 crops or so, and mostly all the fun stuff, all the fruits and vegetables and nuts and grains, those are the things that honeybees really pollinate. And so there have been several kind of visual examples that exemplify this. For example, these are a series of photos that depict breakfast with bees versus breakfast without bees. So here you see cranberry juice, jam on your toast, fruit salad, nuts and dried fruits in your granola, even milk in your coffee. All of those things would disappear if it weren't for honeybees. The link to the milk in your coffee is that honeybees obviously do not pollinate cows, right? However, honeybees do help in the production of alfalfa seed. Alfalfa is used to grow hay, which is fed to cows. So kind of indirectly speaking, you know, even things like dairy and cheese and those kind of things can be attributed, at least partially, to honeybee pollination. So it really shows the extent that honeybees have. Now, while you may be aware of the importance of bees in pollination, the production of these different foods, what you might not be aware is that the vast majority of the bee colonies in the United States that do that pollination service for growers is done so at a pretty massive scale. So most beekeepers in the United States have only a handful of hives, and they only own about 5% of the honeybee population in the US. The other 5% of the beekeeper population owns 95% of the beehives. And they are the ones that are contracted by growers of various crops to move their beehives into the orchards or fields during the blooming period and then the bees will issue forth from the hives and perform that pollination service. And so most of the beehives in the US every single year are placed onto flatbed trucks and moved from one place to another, pollinating these different crops. And in fact, the migratory routes of these commercial pollinators is vast. It's been estimated that the average honeybee colony in the US travels an average of 8,000 miles a year. Most of them going out to Northern California to pollinate one single crop, that is the almond crop, and then they move back to other places in the US pollinating different crops all across the states. And so of the 2.4 million beehives in the United States, about 1.5 million of them go in February or so to Northern California to pollinate almonds. So there's a huge concentration of all the beehives every single year in one place, and then they further disseminate to other regions of the US pollinating different crops. Now, that's kind of the way things are, that there's these consolidation of beehives into just a relative handful of beekeepers in the US, and they're the ones that are doing this pollination on a commercial scale. But it didn't always used to be that way. Today, again, we have about 2.5 or so million beehives in the US. But at the end of the Second World War, there was somewhere more to about 6 million beehives. And there's been a steady decline ever since in the decades that follow, as you can see here in this graph, in large for a whole variety of reasons. One is kind of the loss of the family farm and the consolidation of agriculture in general. And so as farms got bigger, then the beekeeping operations to provide that pollination service got bigger as well. So there was a decline in the number of beehives and beekeepers for that reason. But there are also numerous other reasons that bees have been dying off and have been under subjective stress for many different reasons, including introduced parasites that we'll talk about briefly, as well as the ongoing issues with pesticides in agricultural settings and elsewhere. And so these accumulation of different factors has resulted in this long and steady decline in the bee population, not just since they've been in the headlines. So this has been something that's been going on for a very, very long time. But probably what you think of when you think of honeybee declines is something much more recent, and it's been termed by the media as colony collapse disorder. And what you might not realize is that North Carolina State has the only known picture of colony collapse disorder as it's happening. And this is it here. So a tree falling on a hive. This is actually after Hurricane Irene. But this is, I guess, the simplistic form of colony collapse disorder. What actually has been termed in the media is something a little more complex and nefarious. And the way that the narrative goes with this phenomenon was that this beekeeper, this migratory commercial beekeeper, one of these beekeepers that places their hives on flatbed trucks and moves them all over the country, by a guy named Dave Hackenberg. And he is a beekeeper that is located in Florida in the winter and up in Pennsylvania in the summer. But he also brings bees out to Northern California for the almonds. And he was in Florida one November day, and he was working a whole yard of honeybees, and they looked very strong and healthy and happy. And then he goes back about 2 weeks later, and he found this kind of bee apocalypse, is what he called it, where really the colonies were, seemingly the bees just disappeared. That they were, many of them were dead, and there were no kind of bees left in the hives. And this is something that bees just never do. They never abandon their young. They never just leave for no reason. And so the normal reasons why the colonies seemed to die off didn't seem to be consistent. It didn't fit the kind of the usual suspects. And so he contacted this gentleman up here on the upper left, a guy named Dennis van Engelsdorp, who was an apiary inspector, who, unlike many of the other people that Dave Hackenberg contacted, actually kind of realized that there was something different going on. And so they came up with this list of all of these different symptoms that seemed to describe this syndrome that became known as colony collapse disorder, and that were different from other reasons why bees were dying. And so the real hallmark of this problem was that the bees would depopulate from, say, 50,000 workers within a single colony down to just a handful or a cluster of bees just within a matter of days or weeks. And so this is something that is very, very unusual and just doesn't seem to be consistent with pesticide poisoning or dying from different parasites. And we know that this can happen very, very quickly because there's lots of young developing brood within the colonies, and somebody had to raise these baby bees, so we know that it happened within just a matter of a few days. Now, if you believe the media from this story, you would believe that all of the bees are dead and they've all died from this colony collapse disorder. But that is far from the truth, and in fact never has been. If we take that 2.5 million honeybee colony population in the US, every year about 1/3 of them die off, which is kind of astounding in its own sense, that that's, you know, 1/3 of these kind of livestock die off every single year. But of those, the 1/3 that dies off, only about 1/4 of them die off for unknown reasons. That is, most colonies die off for kind of typical reasons, and only about 1/10 of them die off by using symptoms that are consistent with colony collapse disorder. So CCD seems to be kind of a minority problem when it comes to colony health. And so a lot of researchers have just been looking at all the reasons why bees die off, not just this specific syndrome per se. But because it's such a mystery that bees are just disappearing without any explanation, it's been very popular in the media, and it's gotten a lot of coverage for all sorts of different reasons. And so there have been stories galore, and in the absence of good empirical information, then speculation really proliferates. And so there's been all sorts of crazy reasons that have been attributed to this colony collapse disorder. You may have heard, for example, that cell phones are killing off the bees. Anybody hear that? Right? That's a story that just doesn't seem to go away. It also really doesn't seem to make a lot of sense if you think about it just for a little bit. If honeybees were dying off because of cell phones, then they would only want to pollinate apples. Okay, you got it. All right. I used to tell that joke, would only pollinate blackberries, but now blackberry's gone, he's no longer. But anyway, so that is clearly not the case. There's also been other suggestions that they ascended to be with Jesus in heaven, that Osama bin Laden was behind it, or possibly to bring back the Soviet Union. All of these are potential causes that are not being actively explored by scientists, or at least by anybody who is respected. Instead, there seems to be consensus among honeybee researchers that there are 3 main areas that seem to be important and actively being researched for underlying causes of CCD. One is nutritional stress. So clearly placing 500 beehives on a flatbed truck and shipping them over to California on a 3-day drive, placing them into an orchard where there's really not a lot of food resources for them, that's pretty stressful. And so how nutritional stress plays into these problems is something that people have been looking at. As I mentioned before, there are all sorts of parasitic mites and viruses and gut protozoa and all sorts of diseases that are afflicting honeybee colonies that seems to be associated, and there's active research into that. And then, of course, different environmental contaminants, in particular, pesticides and insecticides that are being sprayed in these agricultural settings and other places, as well as the pesticides that beekeepers themselves are using to fight off some of those diseases that I mentioned in the previous slide. And so a lot of these different factors, in fact 61 different independent variables, were tested among colonies that had collapsed versus those that were strong and healthy sitting right next to them. And no one single factor really emerged as an explanatory variable. In other words, there was no smoking gun that we could identify in trying to see that this causes CCD or this does not. However, a lot of different things have emerged from the science since then, and that is honeybees are subject to contamination by all sorts of different pesticides in the environment. This is just a small histogram of a laundry list of over 100 different pesticides that were found in the beehives, both healthy and sick. And so, again, there was no one pesticide that seemed to be linked with CCD versus healthy colonies, but there were a lot of different pesticides in the beeswax and in the bees themselves, that many of which are very unhealthy for bees. And so it's a very complicated chemical environment for the bees and that they're living in. Now, what's really striking about these findings is that there were 2 compounds that were found in every single honeybee colony that was surveyed. Both of these are active ingredients to fight off parasitic mites of the bees themselves. So these are the products that beekeepers themselves are applying to the colonies. And what's scary about that is that there has been research showing that each one of these is really good at killing off the mites, but not nearly as good as killing off the bees when they're used singly, but in combination they can synergize and be much more problematic for the bees themselves. So pesticides may be an issue, but it may not be just the pesticides out in the environment. It may be associated with what the beekeepers themselves are using. But what does seem consistent in study after study is that the colonies that are collapsing have about 3 times the number of different bugs in them, parasites, pathogens, viruses, all sorts of things that are making them sick versus the colonies that are healthy. Now that may seem like a foregone conclusion, but we don't know at this point if the diseases are what's causing the collapse or if there's some other factor that is causing the bees to become more prone to acquiring disease. So we don't know if these pathogens in the colonies are a cause or an effect, but they definitely seem to be associated with these collapsing incidents. And so, you know, bees that are dying are sicker. We just need to understand whether that's the reason that they're dying or whether there's something else that's triggering their immune system compromise, which makes them more sick. So the conventional wisdom right now in the truth behind why the bees are declining is that it's a multifactorial problem, that there's lots of different reasons why bees are dying. And what it seems like is that there isn't just a single factor or even a single combination of factors, but in some instances, viruses may be playing a big role in association with, say, parasitic mites. But in other instances, it could be the mites and some internal disease or nutritional stress that may result in collapse. So there may be multiple routes to colonies dying off in these vast numbers. And so that makes it very difficult to pin down a single cause, but it also shows how profound and how difficult this question is and how important it really is. And so with that brief overview, I'd be happy to take questions.
So it sounds like, you know, with the multiple factors involved with colony collapse disorder, that one of the common factors would just be the immune function of the bee itself. And so with social insects, you know, there's the individual response, but there's also a social response to pathogens. So has there, I'm sure there has, but, you know, has there been any work done on looking at how those responses change in response to these nutritional stress and that sort of thing?
So that's a great question, in the sense that because honeybees are social, they also have these behavioral responses, and there are several that are very important. One is that they, believe it or not, can self-medicate. So honeybees can go out and collect this special substance called propolis. Anybody heard of that before? Propolis? They collect from tree resins these very complex compounds, and it's very sticky. And they bring it back, and what they use it for is like caulk. So they seal all the cracks in the hive, so everything is nice and air and watertight. But they also varnish all the inside of the hive, making it very sticky, but it also has antimicrobial properties. So it's a way for them to stave off infection. There are other behavioral mechanisms as well, but that's a good example of just how complex and how cool honeybees are. There hasn't been a study that looks at colony collapse disorder and resin collection per se, but there have been studies where they actually kind of intentionally infect a honeybee colony with like a fungal pathogen, and the bees will upregulate their propolis collection. So they are responding and self-medicating to that. But the overall issue of social immunity, is what it's called, in honeybees, is that the downside is that they don't have as good an immune system at the individual level. So by looking at the genome of honeybees compared to solitary insects like mosquitoes, say, or Drosophila, honeybees have about 1/3 fewer immune genes than solitary insects. So they actually rely more on these behavioral mechanisms to keep from getting infected. And so if whatever is causing colony collapse or these other health issues can be circumventing those behavioral things, that could be why they're more susceptible. Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you.
All right, so I know you was looking at different reasons why we're losing colonies, but have any solutions of what we can do been thrown around that will help them like boost it back up?
So it's a good question, and it's something that beekeepers have been clamoring for about 6 years, is, what can they do in order to prevent it or to kind of rescue from it? And until a cause is found, we're not going to be able to say with any sort of certainty about, how to prevent it, right? So there's a chicken and egg problem. But there have been studies done of taking the hive that has been abandoned, so the bees have died off, and then putting new bees in it. And those colonies don't seem to die off again. So it doesn't seem to be transmitted. It doesn't seem to be infectious in the same way as if you had a bed where somebody died from Ebola and then somebody else slept in it, right? That would be highly infectious. So it doesn't seem to be transmitted in that way. So that's actually very helpful to the beekeepers, because when their colonies die off, the colonies that are left, they can take one colony and they can split it in half and put a new queen in that other half, and now they have 2 colonies. So they can grow colonies back every single year. It's difficult when you lose a high proportion of the colonies, but they are still able to do it. If you had 100 cattle and half of them died, you can't split a cow in half and now have 2 cows, right? But you can do that with honeybee colonies. And knowing that the equipment itself is not, contaminated, that makes it possible for the beekeepers, and that's been very a big relief to them. And so that's how they've been able to keep up to this point.
So I know you said that a lot of the research that you've been doing and a lot of the honeybees are actually in these colonies that we ship around. But what's happening in natural colonies, ones that are just, say, out in the woods that are doing other pollination? And is this a problem with them? Does anybody know? And I guess...
So that's an excellent question, and that actually does touch on some of our research as well. So honeybees are, domesticated. Most of them are trucked around, but many of them live in trees or, natural cavities. They're unmanaged or feral. And they're our state insect here in North Carolina, but they're not native. They're all imported from the old world, right? So all of the bees not living in a beekeeper's box are all escapees, kind of like feral cats, right? There are feral honeybees. And so there once thrived a huge feral population in the US, but the introduction of some of these parasites in the 1980s and other things have all but wiped them out. So there really aren't a whole lot of those feral nests around, but where they can be found, and we are trying to locate them and study them to see how they're able to persist, whereas the bees in our boxes are having a hard time. And so we're actually studying the feral population to try and learn their secrets. The problem is we can't kind of see if colony collapse disorder affects them as easily as we can in the hives that we own. So we don't know if they are subject to the same phenomenon as managed honeybee colonies are. But we do know that they have the same diseases, the same parasites. They just seem to persist with them more readily. Okay. So they seem to be able to live a little bit better than our bees. So we're trying to uncover their secrets, but will take a long time to discover that.
So my next question would be, because you've talked mostly about the United States, is this happening for bee colonies that people are keeping around the globe as well? So is it a global issue, or is it mainly an issue here?
Another great question. Large-scale honeybee die-offs is a worldwide phenomenon. Whether or not Europe and Australia, they are going through colony collapse disorder in the strict sense is unclear until we, again, understand the reasons behind it. Okay. But it is a worldwide problem of bees dying off and beekeepers having a problem. Now that in and of itself speaks to the potential reason not being just the fact that the beehives are being placed onto flatbed trucks and trucked all over the place. Because in Europe, they don't really do that. They have smaller scale operations. They still kind of have that family farm system for pollinating. But their bees are dying off as well, and in many cases inexplicably. But again, whether it's one and the same factor, we're not sure.
Okay, and then my last question would be, what about these Africanized bees that have kind of invaded from the south, and what role are they playing? Is it affecting them as well, or do we know?
Yeah, so the Africanized bees used to be the main problem with bees, right, before this. And now it's barely mentioned. But they live in a feral way. Again, they don't live in boxes. They live in natural cavities. And much like the other feral population, we don't really know if they're subject to the same phenomenon. So it'd be very interesting to know that. But they also have been shown in many other cases to be more tolerant of some of these other parasites. So some people have argued that they may be our savior, that these Africanized bees may actually be a blessing in disguise. They're really known, of course, for their high defensive behavior. So they're very stingy compared to the other types of bees. So it kind of takes all the fun out of beekeeping. But they may have some things to offer, right? So if we can untangle those things, that would be best. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
So, my question was, if this pattern keeps happening, all the bees keep dying, how long will it be till our food supply is affected, or chapstick and things like that?
That's a really great question, and I wish I would have addressed that before, because I was saying that every year about a third of the honeybee population dies off, right? So a lot of us have been worried that in the media, if they're the media is really primed to want to tie a nice bow on this story and then move on. Yeah. So over the last 5 years or so, the media has proclaimed about 5 times the end of CCD. but that's not really the case. And we're worried that there may be a crying wolf phenomenon, right? Because what's happening is not the population of colonies, a third of them die off, and then another third, and another third, and another third. Mm-hmm. What happens is that the colony population, about a third dies off, and then the beekeepers scramble like crazy to build the numbers back up. Mm-hmm. And then the next winter they die off, and then they build them back up. So every year the population's doing this. Yeah. Sometimes more, sometimes less. And so what that provides is not an ever increasingly shrinking population, but a less stable one, mm-hmm. right? So every single year we need a certain number of beehives to pollinate all our food. And every year we don't know if we're going to meet those requirements. So really what we're looking for is a sustainable population. And I don't know the answer to that of how few is too few, but every single year we get really, really close. Yeah.
And does like drastic climate change have anything to do with like mortality?
So that's a really good question. And in this way, honeybees are probably buffered in many ways to climate change. Honeybee colonies regulate the internal temperature of the nest to about 95 degrees. They like it nice and toasty, right? So when it gets cold, they actually shiver to create heat. When it gets too hot, they go out and collect water and they fan their wings and they create air conditioning to cool the hive down. Mm-hmm. So they can regulate the temperature really well. Yeah. But where they're susceptible, and where all bees are susceptible in this way, is that if the landscape changes, if there's not a lot of flowers out there for them to eat, if there's kind of greater climate change and landscape changes, then they might be affected. But as far as temperature goes, they're actually probably okay. Good questions.
I watch cartoons with my kids, and one of the cartoons, the little honeybee was talking about how they never go back to the same honey pot once they leave. Could that have an effect on bees once you put them back in the same?
So they've also fed the honey stores from the colonies to other bees, and it doesn't seem to, again, make them more sick. So, you know, the hive itself is the wax combs, and that's where they live, and that's also where they store the food. And so that's something that, again, doesn't seem to be infectious after the fact, which is curious. The other thing, too, is that they can also take the queen, or there's only one mother queen, and she's the mother to the 50,000 daughter workers within the colony. So they can take a queen from a collapsed colony and put her in another colony, and she'll start laying again and everything's fine. So she doesn't seem to be infectious either. So it definitely seems to be something biological that's infecting them, but it's not being retained in the bees or in the colonies. Yeah.
I know that you said that the honeybee population plays a huge role in pollination. So is there any other insects or maybe like organisms that can help with pollination?
Great question, and that topic is covered in the 40-minute version of this. Because honeybees are kind of the heavy lifters and kind of the workhorses of pollination. But the unsung heroes are the 4,000 other bee species that also do a lot of pollinating, okay? So honeybees are really useful, especially on large scale, where they can be trucked in and out of these orchards and crops, right? But there's lots of other bees out there that also do this pollination, but they do so kind of just naturally, right? They can't, they're solitary. They're just living on their own, living in the woods, living in, in the ground. And they also do a lot of this pollination, but they can't be managed. They can't be moved. They often have short lifespans. Honeybee colonies live all year round, right? So they're not quite as amenable to all agricultural production system. They tend to specialize, right? And they tend to be local. And so those other bee species are also really, really critical but they can't be manipulated in the same way that honeybee colonies can, right? So there's been a lot of work on these other kind of native pollinators as well, often because on a bee for bee basis, those bees are much better at pollinating a lot of these crops than honeybees are. Honeybees are they're generalists, and so they're not necessarily as good on every single crop. But these other bee species like carpenter bees and bumblebees and sweat bees, a lot of these other types of bees are really, really good at pollinating. It's just there are fewer numbers of them. So honeybee colonies are used for quantity over quality, and the fact that they can be trucked, all over the place at will. So those other species, there's a lot of attention being paid to them as well they should. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the discussion.